Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
And I'm Andrew Malaris. Today we're talking about the impact of the progressive movement on education policy. Paul, what was the progressive movement? Who were the progressives?
The progressives were political and administrative reformers, and they wanted to do reform in education as well as in many other areas. They were a force in American politics at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Their movement begins with a group called the Mugwumps. They didn't like Democrats, they didn't like Republicans, they didn't take a stand on many issues. They sat on the fence, and so they were called Mugwumps because they had their mug on one side of the fence and their wump on the other side of the fence, and that was the joke of the day. But the progressives evolved as a political force. They were a group of professionals. Lots of academics were part of it. A lot of journalists were a part of it. The most famous progressive was Teddy Roosevelt, who was a very exciting president who spoke a lot and did try to break up corporate power in America. And he did create the national park system that we enjoy today. So the progressives left a great legacy.
Where did these reformers get their education platform?
That was part of the overall vision. Education reform was also to take politicians out of education and put science and administration into it. But they also had an education philosophy, and that was introduced by John Dewey. To understand that, let's go to the laboratory school at the University of Chicago, where John Dewey taught. I'm standing in the corridor of the laboratory school at the University of Chicago, the place where John Dewey developed his ideas in education. My own children went here, and I was president of the Board of Education, so it's an honor to be here and to think about John Dewey's ideas and how he acquired them. His own education was quite different. He grew up in Vermont. He was the son of an Orthodox congregational minister. His mother was against all frivolity. She was against gambling, drinking, even playing marbles on Sunday. His school was the Little Red Schoolhouse. Phonics, math tables, memorizing the classics, very repetitive. He hated school. In high school, his English teacher would say, there's a rule against that, whenever a grammatical question came up. Other teachers in the school were known for whipping the kids nearly every day. The school itself was a hazard and was torn down shortly after he graduated. But that all changed when he got to college. When he got to college, he was introduced to Romanticism, feminism, all the new ideas that were rejecting the past, whether it was Rousseau or Hegel or Marx. But the biggest change in his life occurred when he goes to the University of Michigan and becomes a professor of psychology, and he meets Alice Chipman at a boarding place where he sat at a table every day for dinner with Alice, and they discussed feminism, romanticism, and education. And soon they were on a quest together to change social and education life in America. He writes a psychology textbook that makes him famous. The text attracted the attention of President William Rainey Harper at the University of Chicago. I'm standing out in front of Harper Library, which was named after the president. The president came to Dewey and said, why don't you come and develop your ideas at Chicago? We'll create a laboratory school for you. So Dewey said, well, my wife could serve as the principal and I could be the director and we could do some interesting things. So Alice and John moved from Michigan to Chicago and for 10 years try out their ideas on the laboratory school campus. And then one day things turned about as cold as it is right now, standing out here in front of Harper Library, in the relationship between President Harper and John Dewey. The faculty over at the laboratory school had started complaining about a husband-wife team running the school. They didn't like that. So the president called in Dewey and said, well, maybe Alice would like to step down as the principal. Well, Professor Dewey did not take kindly to that suggestion, and he immediately resigned on the spot, despite the fact that he had no other job and he had mouths to feed at home. And so the story changes. He goes to Columbia University, becomes more of a philosopher than a practitioner, Alice begins to raise a growing family of 5 children, as women did in those days. And Dewey's contributions to the progressive movement are more philosophical than practical. It's left up to his followers, really, to carry out his ideas.
Paul, where did Dewey get his educational ideas?
Well, he owed his thinking to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher of the 18th century, 100 years earlier. And Rousseau took a certain way of thinking about education to the utter extreme. He said that you should do nothing and let nothing be done so that the child would learn whatever he needed. So the best education, the best teaching was nothing. The pupil should never learn anything by heart. Reading is a terrible thing. Reading is the greatest plague of childhood. If nothing is to be exacted from children by way of obedience, it follows that they will only learn what they feel to be of actual and present advantage. Rousseau obviously took child-centered learning to the extreme, but it was an insight that Dewey found interesting. And when Dewey was writing, he was working in a world where there was a lot of rote learning. Everybody was told to repeat things over and over and over again. And that's the kind of education he'd had. McDuffie readers, where you learn the rote method to say it over and over again. And in math, it was drill and kill, those flashcards. So Rousseau's ideas had a certain appeal to Dewey.
Okay, how did Dewey apply Rousseau's ideas?
Well, he had 2 major tenets. One is accept the child as that person is, because every child is different. And 2, arouse the natural curiosity of the child. Both of these things are taken directly from Rousseau, but Dewey found a way of saying them in a more reasonable manner.
Okay, let's talk about this first tenet. How did it affect progressive education reform?
Well, this natural curiosity of the child, this idea that every child learns differently. Today we're using that when we're talking about digital education and customized education, and saying that every child should learn at their own pace, in their own way, addressing the material from their own particular point of view. But initially, this idea was taken in a quite different direction, where you would classify kids into different categories and say, okay, these are the smart kids, these are the middle range kids, these are the slow kids. And then you would put them in different classes, give them different educational experiences. Some would go on to college, others would be slated into semi-skilled jobs, others would just be workers. So we're still trying to struggle with the same kind of issues that developed out of Dewey's idea that you accept each child as that child is.
Let's move on to Dewey's second idea. How did that impact progressive education reform?
Well, Andrew, the old-fashioned approach was teach phonics, learn how to say A, E, I, O, U, or learn your consonants, all that very specific pronunciation, and then start putting your words together from that. And then you learn all those words very specifically, and then you start putting them into sentences. Well, the new idea was the whole word method, where you begin to think more about learning context, and you gradually learn all these pronunciations in a much more substantive and intuitive way. And we moved away from memorizing all those mathematic tables through the drill and kill method, the flashcards, which is what I had when I was in school, not so many years ago, I'd like to think. And so now you're supposed to learn your math by applying it and trying to solve problems. So this is the new progressive approach to education that grew out of Dewey's philosophy. So the debate over instruction is one that goes on down to the present time. You have some charter schools today who say that you should have the old-fashioned traditional approach because there's a lot of kids from disadvantaged backgrounds that need to be taught the very basic concepts because they weren't taught them at school or in preschool or at home. And then there are other charter schools who are very progressive, and they say, okay, you should let children learn on their own. So we're debating these same philosophical issues today just as much as Dewey was back then.